So today we are talking about one of my favorite pet reptiles. We are doing a complete care guide on the Shneider Skink. I'm quite excited about this one because there's not a whole lot of information out there, and I am very happy to be able to share my experience with you. So just a quick background, I'm not going to make this long and boring, but I've been keeping Shneider Skinks for quite a while. We have started to breed them this past season. We did have some success. We had 3 locks, we had 4 eggs, and those eggs are due to hatch between today, tomorrow, and the next day. So within the next 3 days, we should have some captive bred Shneider Skinks. We're super excited. And I'm even more excited to see interest in Shneider Skinks on the rise. It's absolutely a species that 100% deserves it. So we're going to get really deep into the care of a Shneider Skink. And as a quick bonus at the end of the video, I'm going to show you guys how I sex my Shneider Skinks, and maybe you can do the same with yours. So this is going to be a lot of information, so I'm really going to try to talk fast. And as with every reptile care guide, please don't just take my advice. Do your research several different care guides, and use your best judgment for your pet Shneider Skinks. So let's get right into it. First off, let's talk about the Shneider Skink's enclosure. I recommend a 4x2x2, but if you're keeping a solo Shneider Skink, you can also go with a 40-gallon enclosure. Although I do still recommend going to that 4x2x2 because they will absolutely love you for it. If you are really strapped for space and you are keeping a solo, you can use that 40-gallon tank. Now with that enclosure, what do you need for substrate? I use a 50-50. I use 50% play sand and 50% soil on one side of the enclosure, which is going to be your cool, humid side. And then I use play sand mixed with rocks on the other side to give it more of that rocky, arid, natural habitat that they are used to. Now, one downside that I will tell you guys is play sand is extremely heavy. If you do have a 4x2x2, please make sure that whatever your enclosure is on top of can support the weight. And you want to have a minimum, very minimum of 4 inches of substrate. This is a burrowing species. And then on top of that substrate, of course, you can add several different things to give it more of that natural deserty feeling, whether that's some sort of brush or dry vegetation. You can really experiment and do whatever you want on the top of it. Moving on, we're going to talk about UVB. So they are a desert species. You do need a higher UVB. I do recommend a T5 Arcadia 12% or T5 Arcadia 14%. Do not use the coil UVBs. Do not disregard UVBs and supplement with D3. Please, please, please provide your Shneider Skinks with the proper UVB. They absolutely need it to thrive. And the UVBs that I use do span the entire enclosure, not just where the basking light is, not on the opposite side of the basking. It spans the entire enclosure. So since we're talking about lights, let's roll right into the basking light. So on one side of the 4x2x2, I keep a 150 watt, which keeps my basking spot at around 110 to 115 degrees. That's right around the perfect zone that you want to keep it on the hot side. If you have your Shneider Skink in a 40-gallon, you're probably going to need a 150 watt bulb, and you're going to want to keep it at that 110 to 115. And then the other side is naturally going to stay a little bit warmer, probably around that 80 to 85 degrees, which is pretty good. But if you're in a 4x2x2, you can experiment a little bit more. I use a 150 watt on one side to give it that 110 to 115. On the left side, I use a 90 watt halogen, which gets it to about 90 to 95 degrees. And then in the middle, we have a perfect little 80 to 85, which gives it a beautiful gradient. And the Shneider Skink has plenty of options to determine where it wants to be and how warm it wants to be. So let's hit on humidity real quick. It might surprise you to know that Shneider Skinks require a little bit of a higher humidity than you might think. So the imports generally come from Egypt, which is where my Shneider Skink came from. Yours might not have come from Egypt. That's something you will only know if you know where they were obtained from the importer. However, there are certain parts of Egypt, like Cairo for example, that gets almost up to 90% humidity overnight. I think consistently on average they're between like 70 and 80% humidity overnight. Now once you get down to southern parts of Egypt, it's closer to that 40 and 50% range, but nonetheless it is quite a humidity spike when you're thinking of an arid species that generally stays around that 20 to 30% humidity during the day. So I do recommend that you mist your Shneider Skink's enclosure at night and in the morning. Give them that humidity spike overnight, let it dry out once you flip those lights on in the morning, and it'll give you that great gradient. But if you have that 4x2x2, you can use the humid side to keep it a little bit more humid. That way, at any point the Shneider Skink wants to be in that humid area, they have that option available. And of course, all the information I'm giving you now is really how you keep your Shneider Skinks during the summer. A few months during the winter, you're actually going to drop temperatures down to around 55 degrees, up to a high of around 65 to 70 degrees. And this is going to be their brumation period, which, if you are interested in breeding Shneider Skinks, it is very important that you do cool them during the winter. If you are not interested in breeding Shneider Skinks, you can most likely skip the brumation period and cooling them off during the winter and just keep that consistent temperature gradient that we previously discussed. Now we are going to move on to diet and feeding. So many of you who have Shneider Skinks might have noticed that when you got your Shneider Skink, they were an absolute pig and they just pigged out and ate everything in sight. And like a month, 2 months later, they just stop eating. They're only eating 1 or 2 bugs a day, or 1 superworm here, a couple crickets there. They're eating a little bit of grub pie on Tuesday, but they're not eating on Wednesday. Shneider Skinks are really obscure when it comes to eating. And so long as they are eating and they are defecating, there's not too much to worry about here. Whether they're eating 4 superworms one day, and then they're only eating 1 superworm the next day, they're only gonna eat as much as they want. And if they don't wanna eat, they're not gonna eat. And this is especially true if you have gravid females. My females that were gravid absolutely refused food for at least a 2-week period during which they were gravid. And it's the day that they laid those eggs, they pigged out like there was a buffet in front of them that was all you can eat. They would not stop eating. So you might have a Shneider Skink that will regularly eat for you. You might have one that's a little bit picky and only wants a little bit of food here, a little bit of food there. It really varies between each and every individual, but just don't be too overly concerned with their eating habits. They are a little bit obscure and they may not eat as much every day as you would expect. I personally try to feed mine every other day. I at least offer them food every other day. Sometimes they will clear the bowl, sometimes they'll leave it to the next day and clear it then. But the important part is they are eating, they are healthy, they are a fantastic weight. They're not overweight, they're not underweight. You don't see the spine going down their back. If you see the spine, they're way too skinny. If you start seeing their hips, they're too skinny. But also, if they appear to be bloated every day, you are likely overfeeding them. And while we're talking about diet, I think it goes without saying that if you are feeding just one thing, you really need to start adding in a variety. So for my Shneider Skinks, I will do crickets, superworms, dubia roaches, mealworms, rapashi grub pie, rapashi bluey buffet, and every now and then I'll try to mix in like some collard greens, and with like the grub pie or the bluey buffet, mix in a little bit of carrots or mix in a little bit of arugula. Just stay away from things like spinach and kale that have the oxalates. But regardless of any of that, your skink probably is going to eat around it anyway. So if you do try to feed them greens within their bluey buffet or their rapashi grub pie, you're gonna have to mince it up very well so they don't notice that it's there. Or they will absolutely eat around it because they are pickier than a 3-year-old that you're trying to force feed broccoli. So let's quickly hit on sexing Shneider Skinks. And this is really probably one of the most difficult things to do for a Schneider. Because even though I'm gonna give you the information to visually sex them, it's not 100% because females can display male traits, males can display female traits, and there's no definitive sexual dimorphism that you're going to quickly pick up right away and understand what sex your Shneider Skink is. But some of these tips might help you in determining that. One thing you can do, which I know is probably not the most efficient way, but it will give you without a doubt a good basis of what your Shneider Skink is when they do defecate, the males will predominantly display their hemipenes while they are pushing. Yeah, I know it's super weird staring at your Shneider skink while they are pooping. I get it, haha. But it does work. So if your male does display his hemipenes, there's no guessing anymore. It is absolutely 100% a male. Now I'd show you an example on camera, but you know, it might get a little bit weird. I'll save you all some graphic imagery today. But males aren't gonna do it every time they defecate. So just be sure that if you don't see hemipenes, that doesn't mean it's 100% a female. But let's throw this picture up and I'm going to kind of explain to you how I visually sex them. So as you can see with the males, we're gonna talk about the male first. Males usually have a bigger indent when it comes to their neck. They have more of like an hourglass shape from their jowls back to their shoulders, whereas a female has more of a straight neck that kind of just blends right into her head. Not to mention, males will have some bigger jowls than the females, which generally leads to a male having a bigger head than a female. Additionally, if we look down the male toward the base of the tail, males generally have a bigger base from their hips to their tail base, which if I had to give you any advice, this is the one that you probably shouldn't try to visually sex your Shneider skinks on, although I know some people do. In my opinion, it is very hit or miss. I've seen females with larger tail bases, I've seen males with smaller tail bases, I've seen males that are just generally smaller than females. Like in this picture of this male locking with this female, the female was much bigger than the male. However, the shape of their head and neck still remain true for both. But if you really want to know more about breeding and introducing Shneider skinks, please take a look at our other videos, part 1 and part 2 and 3 of breeding Shneider skinks, which will give you a lot more in-depth and details about that process. But in any case, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you're looking at Shneider skinks, congratulations on getting one of the best pet reptiles that you can possibly get. Hope you guys enjoyed, and we will see you in the next one.